I saw the stage lights tremble before my heart did. Gary, Indiana, a chilly, humid night in 1964. The stage lights overhead in the low-ceilinged room seemed to be clinging to their last few seconds of luminescence. I vividly remember the cold air, faintly smelling of old wood, mixed with the metallic scent of cables and peeling paint from the opposite wall. That night, I, Jackie Jackson, was only a few years older than Michael, yet I felt the pressure as though I were standing before an invisible tribunal. We had performed in many small venues like this, dilapidated city bars, dreary community halls, rickety wooden stages, but that night, there was something in the air of that room that made it hard to breathe. It wasn't the crowd or the noise. It was more like the feeling you get when you step into a dark alley and your intuition tells you that this place once witnessed a truth that only the night dared to keep secret. I looked at Michael. He was only 6, his performance clothes a little large for his tiny frame. Michael spun the toe of his shoe, taking a long breath that was both innocent and strangely powerful. But I saw something else, a hard-to-read stillness, the kind of silence belonging to someone about to take the stage, but carrying an unnamed fear within. The band was tuning their instruments behind us. That clanking sound resembled the turning of a key in a lock to a door I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. I leaned down and whispered, "You okay, Mike?" Michael looked at me, his large eyes reflecting the faint stage lights. "I'm fine, Jackie. It's just... the stage feels narrower than last time." That comment sent a shiver down my spine. For some reason, I felt as if Michael was standing too close to something we were unprepared to face. When the MC's voice rang out, the crowd erupted like a wave. The applause merged into a driving drumbeat, much like a heart beating with breathless anticipation. I put my hand on Michael's back and gently pushed him forward, and in mere seconds, the boy stood beneath the lights as if he was born to be there. I always knew Michael had a strange aura. Even as a child, he had a way of making the audience follow his every small move. But that night, that aura suddenly made me uneasy. It was too bright, making the stage seem to recede behind him, only for him to move closer to the edge. I started singing, but every line felt torn apart by a feeling of invisible vigilance. My eyes couldn't leave Michael. He moved forward, bouncing, turning to the rhythm, carefree as a small bird that had found its own sky. But that sky ended right at the edge of the stage, an old, rough wooden edge that no one thought to check beforehand. The audience couldn't take their eyes off him. They began to cheer, stomping their feet. The sound drummed in my head, scrambling my thoughts. He took one more step, then another. My heart skipped a beat. "Michael, step back!" I wanted to shout, but the music and the noise of the hall swallowed every word. The light shone directly onto Michael's face, intensely bright. I knew it because I saw him squint. That light focused on the boy, like an invisible knife cutting away half his field of vision. In that instant, I saw the edge of the stage right beneath his feet, a chilling reality slowly rising from the darkness. He couldn't see that drop. I took a step forward, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The deathly silence in my mind contrasted sharply with the audience's excited screams. I heard a very small thud as Michael's toe touched the very edge of the stage. I wanted to rush forward. I wanted to yell. I wanted to pull him back, but I was a beat too late, just one beat. In that moment, from my perspective, Michael looked like he was being pulled forward by an unseen force. The slip wasn't large, but enough to make him tilt completely. A moment that stretched into what felt like forever, as time slowed down so I could clearly see every line on his face, and then Michael vanished from the light. The entire world seemed to go dark with that moment. I heard a deep, collective gasp from the audience, not from one person, but from the entire crowd, as if everyone was choked by that single moment of horror. I stood frozen. All memory, every thought, every instinct felt gripped by a cold hand. Only one sentence echoed in my head. No, not Michael. From the edge of the stage, a deep, dark space seemed to open its mouth to receive him. That night, when he fell off the stage, I felt as though I had witnessed something beyond a child's comprehension, something that wasn't an accident, not a mishap. It felt like a verdict of fate, just delivered by a tiny sound, but one loud enough for me to remember for the rest of my life. The stage lights were still glaring, but my entire world at that moment was plunged into the deepest shadow I had ever known. I could no longer hear the music, the cheers of the audience, or feel the heat from the lights shining directly on my head. Everything was devoured by that single moment. The instant Michael vanished from my sight, no one reacted in time. The entire crowd stood frozen like wooden statues. I could distinctly hear my heart pounding so violently it felt like I would fall over, as if every beat was trying to push me to follow him down. I dashed toward the edge of the stage, my knees wanting to buckle, but my body driven by an instinct stronger than fear. My shoes slipped slightly on the wooden floor because I ran too fast, and as I knelt by the edge, my breath hit the cold air below as if I were breathing into a bottomless, dark well. I peered down, and I saw Michael lying motionless, a moment too brief to be called despair, yet long enough to make me feel as if my soul had left my body. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Instead, a strange feeling of emptiness spread through me. It was like the feeling you get when you stand outside a room you don't want to open, but you must because someone you love is inside. I jumped down, no thought, no deliberation. I didn't even feel my feet hit the floor below. The landing was harder than I expected, but I didn't care, because as soon as I stood up, I realized the one thing that made my heart leap with a suffocating force. Michael was still breathing. He lay on his side, his breath shallow, eyes closed, but he was breathing. My entire body trembled with relief, but that sense of emptiness didn't fade. It lingered like a warning that what I had just witnessed wasn't the worst of it. Mike, can you hear me?" I whispered, my voice so hoarse I barely recognized it. Suddenly, a very small sound, like the brush of a dry leaf in the wind, came from him. Michael moaned softly. I had never heard a sound that made me want to burst into tears so much, but my tears didn't fall. I couldn't let them fall. I felt as if one drop of tears touched the ground. My fragile composure would instantly shatter. I bent down to check, afraid that simply touching him would cause him pain. But Michael slowly opened his eyes. A black pupil, still dusted with stage debris, looked straight at me. "Jackie," he whispered. I looked at him for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because there was something in those eyes that sent a chill down my spine. Not fear, not pain, but a calmness that was terrifying for a 6-year-old who had just fallen off a stage. "I'm fine. I just got dizzy," Michael said, his voice small yet strangely clear. Dizzy. The way he spoke made the event sound less like a fall that had silenced the entire hall. It was as if he had only stumbled on a step while playing in the yard. I didn't know what to do with that composure. Part of me wanted to hug him. The other part was afraid that if I did, I would shake something deep within him, something I couldn't fathom. Up on the stage, the audience began to murmur. Disjointed sounds reached us. "Is the boy okay? He really fell and vanished. Has anyone gone down to check?" Those words felt like needles pricking the back of my neck. Not because they were worried, but because I heard a mixture of anticipation and excitement in some voices, as if they were watching an unexpected, dramatic scene. That was what made me feel a profound dread. I looked at Michael again. He propped himself up on the wooden floor, trying to sit up. I wanted to stop him, but my hand, extended midair, froze when he shook his head. "Let me try," Michael said. That look of determination made me step back, not because he was brave, but because a 6-year-old should not have eyes like that. I helped him stand up slowly, little by little. His small legs trembled slightly, but they bore his weight. He placed a hand on the wall for balance, then looked up at the edge of the stage where the light shone down, forming a straight streak like a blade. "I want to go back up there," he said measuredly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I stared at him. "Michael, you just fell. You need rest." He shook his head immediately. "No. If I don't go back now, they'll think I quit." My breath caught in my throat. I had never heard him utter such a heavy sentence. It carried both determination and the fear of being left behind, as if he was fighting against something bigger than the fall itself. I didn't know that, in that moment, a small decision by a 6-year-old boy would change that entire night and the rest of our lives. As I took Michael's hand, preparing to lead him back into the blinding light above, I realized one thing. The moment he stood up wasn't just standing up after a fall. It was standing up before the gaze of destiny. When I took Michael's hand, I distinctly felt a coldness spread from his palm to mine. Not the coldness of the weather, but the coldness of change, a transformation I couldn't yet explain. Michael stood beside me, his form small in the darkness beneath the stage. Above us, the light still shone down on the narrow space like a waiting eye, waiting to see what we would do next, waiting to see if the boy would return. The audience above was no longer murmuring as they were when he fell. A spreading silence was slowly taking hold, like a thin layer of mist covering the entire room. the kind of silence that leaves people unsure of what is about to happen, but certain that it will change the entire course of the night. I squeezed his hand lightly. Michael, are you sure? He looked up, directly into my eyes. That gaze was so calm. It was disquieting. I have to go up, he said, word for word, as if they had been rehearsed in his head for a long time. Why do you have to? You're just a kid, Mike. He didn't answer immediately. He bowed his head, took a deep breath, and then whispered as if he feared someone else more than me might hear. I can't let them down. I felt my chest tighten. That sentence should not have come out of a 6-year-old's mouth, but it did. The lights on the stage began to flicker slightly, signaling to the band that the show had been interrupted for too long. People started looking at each other. There were a few coughs, a few quiet calls. No one knew how to behave when a child had just fallen off the stage. I put my arm around Michael's shoulder, gently lifting him onto the small wooden step to push him back onto the stage surface. That slight lift should have been easy, yet why did it feel as heavy as pushing the entire fate of our family back to where the bright lights shone? When Michael put his foot on the stage, I saw his shoes tremble slightly. He said nothing. I knew he was struggling between his fear and his stage instinct. I followed him up, but a beat slower. I wanted to observe. I wanted to make sure he wouldn't go too close to the edge again. And then something happened that froze me in place. Michael stood right in the center of the spotlight. The entire room fell silent, a silence so eerie I felt as though the room was holding its breath. Even the band members paused, their fingers hovering over the strings as if afraid to touch anything that would break this moment. Michael raised his hand, gently adjusting the microphone. A very small, subtle movement, but in that space, taut as a bowstring, it echoed like a signal. And then he smiled. Not the innocent smile of a child, not a forced smile to hide fear, but the smile of someone returning to the battlefield they believed they belonged to. I stood behind him, covered in goosebumps. The audience let out a very small, collective awe, almost like a communal sigh. I glanced at them, shadowed faces, wide eyes, hands clenched on the backs of chairs. They were unsure whether to worry or to anticipate, but they didn't take their eyes off him. Michael looked around the stage, not at anyone specific, just at the space, as if measuring the distance between himself and destiny. Then he spoke, his voice so clear it echoed right into my heart. I want to start from the part I missed. The entire band was startled. So was I. The sound technician backstage even dropped his pen. A 6-year-old boy who had just fallen off a stage saying that no one on earth could be mentally prepared for a moment like that. The band looked at each other, amazed, but no one objected. Not because they agreed, but because they knew. This was a moment no one was allowed to intervene. I took one more step, standing beside him. I could feel Michael's breath, steady, even, and strangely untrembling. On the contrary, I was the one shaking. As the music intro played again, every note, every beat, like stones rolling backward up a hill, I felt my throat constrict. I knew this chapter of our lives was turning a new page. That page was not bright, not dark, but completely blank, ready to be written upon by whatever was about to happen next. Michael held the microphone with both hands, bowing his head slightly. Then he opened his eyes. That gaze electrified the entire room. But only I could see what lay at the bottom of that look. Something too heavy for a child to carry on his shoulders. And in that moment, I didn't know whether I should be proud or afraid. The first sound of the music intro felt like a heavy metal door slowly opening before me. Each drum beat falling onto the air, which had thickened with anticipation, sounded like the footsteps of something no one could predict from behind the shadows. I stood right behind Michael, close enough to hear his very subtle breath, but also far enough to feel as though I was seeing a completely different person standing in front of me. When the light shone directly onto his face, I saw clearly, not a trace of shaking. A 6-year-old child who had just fallen off a stage, who had just faced the eyes of hundreds of people, should have been afraid, should have cried, or at least clung to someone. But Michael, he stood straight, hand gripping the microphone, eyes looking further than this small room, as if he didn't return because he was forced, as if he returned because he knew this place belonged to him. And that feeling, the sense that he stepped into a familiar battleground, sent a chill right through my core. The hall remained silent, so silent I could hear the faint tremble of the guitar strings as the player touched them. Then Michael subtly lifted his chin, A small movement, but enough to make the entire room lean toward him, as if drawn into the stillness surrounding the tiny boy. After a second as long as a century, Michael sang. It was still his voice, clear, high, and full of energy. But that night, the tone carried something I had never heard in any child, a streak of unwavering resolve, thin yet sharp, like a blade glinting in the dark. I instantly felt my heart skip a beat. The audience, without any prompting, stood up. The applause exploded like a firework that had been suppressed for too long, now uncontrollably released. They weren't applauding because we sang well, not because they knew Michael was okay, but because they had just witnessed what people only see in fateful moments. A child getting up after a fall, stronger than before. I swear to myself that I saw in the eyes of a few people surprise mixed with apprehension. Apprehension because they couldn't understand how that boy could return to the stage as if nothing had happened. A man in the front row still hadn't sat down. He leaned forward, hands clutching his chair. "Look at him," he whispered, his voice mingling with the cheers. Like he never fell. That sentence slid into my ear like a cold needle. He didn't know I stood only a few feet from Michael when he vanished beneath the stage. I knew how he fell. I knew that landing was not light. But right now, looking at him standing in the light, I started to doubt my own memory of the past few minutes. Michael turned slightly to the rhythm, his feet only a few inches from the stage edge. My heart felt like it was leaping out of my chest. "Step back a little," I whispered, almost inaudibly. He didn't hear, or deliberately ignored it. A small moment, but it made all my senses flare up as if I were electrocuted. If he took just one wrong step. But strangely, he didn't move forward. He didn't retreat. He held his position, as if he knew his own boundary and knew the stage's boundary even better than I did. A part of me felt relieved. The other part felt even more chilled, as if the fall was not an accident but a test, and Michael had passed it with an unexpected composure. When the song reached the climax, Michael lifted his voice. His small body leaned gently with the rhythm, the light running along his black hair like thin streaks of brightness. The entire room swayed along, as if drawn into his own heartbeat. The band caught up with that energy. They played harder, fuller, as if they were the backdrop to elevate Michael. I also harmonized, but the truth was, my voice was completely submerged in his sound and the audience's growing roar. Michael didn't just sing, he commanded the room. Then the moment that made the entire hall erupt happened. During the musical break, when all instruments stopped for a second, Michael didn't stand still as he did in rehearsals. Instead, he raised his hand, lightly tossed his hair, and tilted his body slightly to the left. A small action, a very slight turn. But the entire room screamed, a passionate, overwhelming, powerful sound that made me feel like the ceiling was shaking. That cheer was not just encouragement, it was like the scream people let out when they realize they have just witnessed something dangerous but too beautiful to look away from. I stood right behind him, and for the first time in my life I felt my back was colder than the air in the room. I knew this was not normal. A boy who had just fallen stood up and made the entire crowd erupt like that. No, it couldn't just be talent. It couldn't just be a child's determination. There was something else in this moment, something bigger, something I dared not name. When the song ended, Michael lowered the microphone. The entire room stood, applauding incessantly, as if they didn't want to let go of that moment. The band looked at each other, astonished, then looked at Michael as if staring at an unsolved mystery. Michael turned to me, gently, completely composed. "I told you, didn't I?" he whispered. I had to go back. I looked at him for a long time, and realized in the depth of his eyes something that momentarily dropped my blood pressure. He didn't just return to the stage, he returned to the exact place he belonged, and that was what made me fearful. The backstage was darker than I remembered. It wasn't ordinary darkness, but the kind that makes you feel as if you are walking down the corridor behind a major secret, a secret you are not ready to face. As Michael stepped off the stage, the entire room was still echoing with applause. It followed us into the backstage area, like the sound of waves chasing someone running from the shore. But to me, that applause didn't sound like congratulations. It sounded like the knocking of something arriving too quickly. Michael walked a few steps ahead of me. His form was small, his shadow stretched long on the wall, trailing a streak of precariousness that made me shudder. I still couldn't forget the moment he stood up after the fall, so composed that the entire room seemed to blur. No child I had ever met, including my brothers, had such poise. When the backstage door closed behind us, the applause outside was muffled by the thick wood. Only the sound of my breath and Michael's echoed in the space. Then Michael stopped. He turned around to look at me, and I, just in that moment, understood why my spine had been cold all night. Michael's eyes were not the eyes of a child who had just experienced an accident and stood up through sheer, reckless instinct. They were the eyes of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, a strange lucidity, a layer of composure I had never seen in anyone, let alone a 6-year-old boy. I was the one to break the silence first. "Are you hurt?" I asked, my voice so dry it startled me. Michael didn't answer immediately. He looked at me for a few seconds, as if weighing something, then breathed softly. "I'm fine, I have to be fine." That simple statement made my hands go cold, not because of the content, but because of the way he said it, slowly, clearly, like someone who had long decided that the stage was the only place he was allowed to belong, no matter what happened. I stepped closer, trying to find a sign of fear on his face. There was none. I saw fatigue, a slight confusion, but no fear, as if the fall was a prelude of fate that he had anticipated. "When you fell," I stammered, "I thought my heart was going to stop." Michael lowered his face, his small hand clenched subtly, as if recalling the moment. "I was just a little blinded," he whispered. I stared at him. I knew. I had seen the light shine directly on him, so bright that half his face was almost swallowed. But what unsettled me was not the fall. It was the entire aftermath, the return to the stage, the composure, the determination, and especially the way he made the entire room explode as if the fall were a calculated move in the script. My voice caught, "Mike, why did you want to go back so quickly?" Michael looked up. This time there was something in his eyes that made me stand still, the fear of being forgotten. That realization in such a tiny child forced me to look away, to regain my composure. A second later, Michael said, "If I didn't go back up, they would see the fall, not my singing." My heart constricted. That statement was not from a 6-year-old. It couldn't be. It was the statement of someone who already understood what the audience expected. Someone who knew the stage forgives no hesitation. Someone who had understood that the most important thing is not falling, but how you rise. I felt a cold current run down my spine. Not because I feared for Michael, but because I feared the future. If he already understood the cruel rules of the stage right now. Then later, when the lights were brighter, the crowds larger, the stages wider, what more would Michael have to sacrifice? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the door. No one entered, no one knocked, but those footsteps, hesitant, as if listening, forced me to look at Michael again. He didn't show fear, no curiosity. He only said very softly, like a breath, "Don't look at them, Jackie, let's go." I involuntarily shuddered. At that moment, I didn't know who the them Michael was referring to were. The audience, the staff, or just his feeling after a fall. But the most awe-inspiring thing was how Michael said that sentence without turning his head, as if he knew someone was standing outside the door, as if he could sense something I could not. I took his shoulder. "Let's go, Mike." He nodded, then walked ahead. And as I watched his shadow stretch on the old wooden floor, I understood that this night was unlike any night before. This night was not just a fall, not just a moment of getting up. It was the first sign that Michael was not just a talented child. He was the child that the spotlight chose, and that was the most terrifying thing of all.